A disabled girl sits alone on graduation day until a billionaire and his daughter walk in. On a gray, rainy afternoon in Boulder, Colorado, in the warm, cozy cafe called Timber and Bean, a young woman sat quietly by the fogged window. Outside, the spring rain fell in steady sheets, blurring the distant mountains into soft shades of gray. She wore a deep red graduation robe, crumpled and heavy after hours spent sitting in her wheelchair. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and her gaze drifted outward as if searching for something both distant and intimately familiar. In her hands rested her bachelor's degree with honors in urban design, an achievement she had fought for through 3 years of rehabilitation, dozens of surgeries, and countless silent attempts to stand again on her own. Yet on this momentous day, no one from her family was present. No hugs, no congratulations, no flowers or applause. Her mother had passed away while she was still in high school, and her father, a busy and distant man, had not even managed to send a single message. Her name was Rachel Monroe. She lowered her head, pulled out her phone, and tried to take a selfie to capture the graduation moment, but nothing felt right. The angle was off. The overhead light left her face pale, and her eyes betrayed a hollow emptiness. In the frame, there was no joy, no pride, only a young woman alone in a crowded room. She tried again, her hand trembling slightly, then deleted the photo. Her face hardened, nothing like the graduation day she had once imagined. The cafe door suddenly swung open. A cold gust of wind swept in, carrying the scent of wet grass and the soft tinkle of a wind chime. A man in his early 40s stepped inside, soaked from the rain. His shirt clung to his body and his shoes squelched with each step. Following him was a little girl around 8 years old, wearing a bright yellow raincoat, clutching a sketchbook, her wide eyes full of curious wonder. They were laughing gently and sincerely, as if sharing an old story on their way there. They brought with them a warm, vibrant energy, completely contrasting with the quiet corner where Rachel sat. The man's name was Eli Turner, and the girl was his daughter Sophie. When Eli's eyes swept across the cafe and settled on Rachel, something inside him paused. Not pity, not curiosity, just a pure, simple attention, as if he had noticed something important that everyone else had missed. He stepped closer quietly and without hesitation, and when Rachel startled and looked up, he simply smiled. Without a word, he knelt down on the rain-slicked floor, pulled an old camera from his pocket, and adjusted the lens. Sophie stood beside her father, tilting her head to look at Rachel, whispering softly about the beautiful robe. Eli did not ask aloud, but with his eyes and gentle smile, he silently invited Rachel to let him take a photo. Rachel nodded, surprised and moved. For the first time that day, she felt truly seen. When Eli pressed the shutter, he chose an angle at her eye level with soft light streaming from the window to illuminate Rachel's face, bringing out the warm hazel in her eyes and coaxing a faint, tender smile. Just one photograph, one act of kindness, yet it became a moment that would change Rachel's life forever. If Rachel's story touched your heart from the very first moments, do not forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel Emotional Echoes, like and share it so you can continue to hear moving and inspiring stories every day. We are eager to know where you are watching from, so please leave a comment, telling us the city, town, or country where you are following the video, so we can see how Rachel's story is spreading across different corners of the world. Let us share our feelings and experiences together, so that stories like this are not only told but also truly reach many hearts. Rachel returned to her small apartment in the late afternoon, still wearing her graduation robe, the camera Eli had used, now neatly waiting in an email he had sent immediately after taking the photograph. She opened the image on her laptop, stretching the frame across the screen, and in that moment, she froze. In the photograph, she was not merely a young woman in a wheelchair holding a degree. She was someone who had just won a long, unseen battle. Her eyes glimmered with something both proud and tender, and the smile, fleeting though it was genuine. But when she closed her laptop, the room immediately fell into an unusual stillness. There was no trace of a mother entering with a bouquet in her hands. No knocking at the door. No message from her father. All she received on her graduation day was a brief email from the private assistant of Charles Monroe. Her father simply offering congratulations and asking if she could send a scanned copy of her diploma for the family records. There was no acknowledgement of his absence, no phone call, no sign that he truly cared. She was not surprised. In truth, she had long grown accustomed to that absence. Since her mother's death when Rachel was 14, her father had vanished emotionally. He always appeared at important events, but only as a figure in a suit shaking hands with the principal, handing over a donation check, and leaving before anyone could cut the cake. As a child, Rachel had tried everything to capture her father's attention. She excelled in school, won awards in design competitions, and even chose architecture because it was a field her father's real estate company would easily approve of. But the older she grew, the more she realized that it was not that he could not see her, but that he chose not to stop and notice. After the accident in Yosemite 3 years earlier, when she had fallen down a rocky slope while climbing alone, he had signed all the treatment papers, paid the hospital bills, and hired the finest rehabilitation specialists. Yet he never asked if she had been afraid, if she had been in pain, or if she regretted anything. To him, the accident was merely an incident to be handled, not a wound to be felt. Throughout her recovery, Rachel had learned to rely on herself. Each morning she recorded the seconds she could sit upright without support. Each night she rehearsed every word of the graduation speech she would never deliver because she had been replaced at the last minute by a sponsored speaker. She did everything alone because she knew that if she did not stand up for herself, no one else would. Yet even after achieving everything, holding the real diploma and receiving the graduation photo, the emptiness inside her remained. Deep down, Rachel did not need another congratulation. She only needed a father willing to sit beside her, look into her eyes, and say, "You did it." But that had never happened, and perhaps it never would. So when Eli Turner, a complete stranger, knelt down on the café floor just to help her have a proper photograph, it stirred something deep within her. Not because he was inherently good, nor because she needed help, but because for the first time in a long time, someone did not walk away. He was unhurried, gentle, and he did not look through her as if she were invisible. He saw her, and that though small touched a part of Rachel's heart she had thought long locked away. That night Rachel lay in bed but could not sleep. The light from her phone screen spilled across the ceiling as she scrolled one by one through the photos in a newly created folder she had named "The Photograph in the Rain." She still did not understand why that single moment had moved her so deeply. A man she had never met, with his wet tousled hair and wrinkled shirt, had made her feel seen more than anyone she had ever known. She thought of Eli, of the look in his eyes as he peered through the camera lens, of the way he had not asked about her wheelchair or her honors degree, but simply smiled as if everything were exactly as it should be. That feeling would not leave her, and a part of her wanted to know more about this man. Who was he? Why had he been there, and how could someone she met for only a few minutes make her feel safe? Rachel opened her laptop and typed Eli Turner's name into a search engine. At first, only a few vague results appeared, but when she added the words "historic preservation," a series of older articles emerged. About 10 years ago, the name Eli Turner had appeared in several construction magazines in Denver. He had been known as a restoration engineer responsible for renovating old theaters, community libraries, and historic schools. The articles spoke of him with reverence, calling him the man who breathed life into old walls, the keeper of memory for a city that was changing day by day. But after a certain year, his name vanished entirely from the media. Rachel found a small note in an old article. His wife, Sarah Turner, had passed away from a motor neuron disease after many years of struggle. No further details, no follow-up interviews, just a void stretching out after a tragic ending. She continued searching, this time through professional forums and public city project records. Eli Turner had once been a strong candidate for a major restoration project in the downtown historic district, but his application had been rejected for lack of an official university degree. Some forum users commented that he was highly skilled but politically inept. Others said he did not know how to please investors, that he was too rigid in his principles. Rachel felt a sharp frustration. She didn't know exactly what made her angry. Perhaps it was familiarity. A person judged not for their abilities, but for failing to follow the path others had laid out. A person excluded not because they were incompetent, but because they did not fit a mold. She silently looked back at the photograph Eli had taken, unadorned, without effects, yet so real it made her want to cry. Then she found a rare post on Eli's social media account from a few years ago, a photo of a perfectly toasted piece of bread with a handwritten note from Sophie saying that her father had made the bread exactly like her mother used to. Rachel did not smile. Inside her was a tight, nameless ache. This man had once had everything and had lost nearly all of it, yet he still knelt, still smiled, still reached out to a stranger in a café, and that thought lingered in her mind. The next morning, while reviewing a draft for the renovation of an old theater in Denver, a project looking for a chief technical lead, Rachel thought of Eli. She paused for a few seconds, then opened the company email and located the candidate file that had been rejected in the first round due to missing credentials. There it was, his name appearing quietly like him. The file had never been properly considered. No one had evaluated the detailed designs, the restoration plan using local materials, or the proposal to preserve the original balcony. All had been dismissed simply because he did not have a formal university degree. Rachel clicked to download the file and read it carefully line by line. The designs were not flashy, but they had depth. They showed respect for the past and meticulous calculation down to every brick. And suddenly, she knew what she had to do, not just to repay a photograph, but because if she had ever been judged for her wheelchair, Eli had also been rejected simply for lacking a piece of paper. Both of them in a way were overlooked profiles, and perhaps it was time for one of them to change that. Rachel sat motionless in front of her laptop for the entire morning. Eli's file remained open before her eyes, every detail of the drawings, every line of notes written in sharp, precise handwriting that seemed to whisper the story of a man who had once loved his work with all his heart. She imagined him during those years standing amid an aging building, tape measure in hand, eyes following every crack in the walls as if listening to the memories still trapped in the bricks. She no longer had any doubt. This man was not only capable, he had heart. And for a project as historically significant as the old Denver theater, she knew he was the only person she wanted to entrust. But as with everything in her life, it would not be simple. The project belonged to Monroe Urban Design, where she had just been appointed project lead for historic preservation. On paper, she had the authority to propose key personnel, but the board of directors, including her father, retained the final say. They would not easily accept someone without a university degree, without current reputation, and most importantly, someone outside the carefully constructed network they had built. Yet for the first time in many years, Rachel did not feel ready to step back. She drafted a short email to Eli, hesitating over each word before finally pressing send. In it, she introduced herself, recalled their chance meeting at the cafe, and concluded with an offer: "I'm looking for someone to lead the restoration of the Denver theater, and I believe you are the most suitable person for the role. If you are still interested in this work, I would very much like to meet and discuss it further." Only a few hours later, Eli replied. His response was brief to the point of seeming almost closed. "Thank you for thinking of me. I'm not sure I still have the strength to step into places like that, but if you truly trust me, I'm willing to listen." The meeting was arranged for a late afternoon at a small restaurant near the city's arts district. Rachel arrived early, chose a corner table, and waited. When Eli walked in, he was still the man with calm eyes, an old but clean coat, and a quiet, understated smile. There was no sign that he had ever been a name mentioned in the media, nor any appearance of eager anticipation for a second chance. But when Rachel began speaking about the project, about the early 20th century theater falling into serious disrepair, about the auditorium with wooden seats that had witnessed generations of audiences, Eli's expression shifted. He did not interrupt. He simply listened gently, turning the glass of water in front of him. Yet Rachel could see in each nod, in each brief question, the depth of his care. Not the kind of care driven by money or fame, but the devotion of someone who had once loved a craft to its very core. When she finished, Eli remained silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I once thought I would never return. When I lost Sarah, I lost much of what had defined me. I used to stand in old buildings and feel useful. But after everything fell apart, I wasn't sure of that anymore." Rachel did not offer hollow encouragement. She simply said, "I think you still have much to give. And if someone like me, who lay immobile for nearly a year, could stand up and learn to trust herself again, then perhaps you can too." Eli looked at her for a long while, then nodded slightly. "I will try. I cannot promise anything grand, but I will try." Rachel said nothing further, only smiled. Inside her there was no relief, only a clear sense that she had laid the first brick of something that could truly change, not just a project, but both of their lives. That morning, the Monroe Urban Design office glowed in the first light of day, the large glass panes reflecting the sun in shimmering patterns across the high ceiling and polished wooden floors. Rachel sat at the long conference table topped with frosted glass, focused on the project plan displayed before her. Yet her mind followed every echoing footstep from the hallway. She had spent the entire week preparing for this presentation, not only because she believed Eli deserved the opportunity, but because she knew this was the true test of her authority since officially having a voice in her father's company. The frosted glass door swung open and Eli Turner stepped inside. He wore a light gray shirt, dark khaki pants, and worn but clean leather shoes. In his hands he carried a neatly printed set of designs encased in a stiff cardboard tube and a simple stack of documents. He did not try to appear artificially professional, yet in his upright posture and calm gaze there was an unmistakable sense of self-respect. The people in the room looked up. Some whispered, some frowned. Diane Walker, head of engineering, flipped quickly through his personal file, casting a scrutinizing glance at Rachel. Beside her, Jared Stone, the budget officer who had never hidden his strictness toward anyone outside the establishment, observed closely. Rachel stood, smiled, and made a brief introduction. "This is Eli Turner, the person I am proposing for the position of lead restoration architect for the Denver Theater project," she continued in a calm but firm tone. "He has many years of field experience and has successfully restored 3 historic buildings recognized by the city. I believe he brings practical insight that our current team lacks." Diane raised an eyebrow. "Does he have an engineering degree?" Before Rachel could respond, Eli spoke softly. "I do not have a formal university degree, but I have 20 years of experience on construction sites, including 8 years leading restoration and reinforcement of historic structures. I am not here to debate credentials. I am here to present a solution for a rapidly deteriorating building that needs to be saved." The room fell silent. Jared furrowed his brow. "We have very specific requirements for budget and safety. Can you ensure compliance?" Eli opened the cardboard tube and laid the design on the table, the hand-drawn plans accompanied by notes on reusable materials methods to reinforce wooden frames without compromising the original architecture, and most importantly, a phased schedule reducing costs by nearly 30% compared to the current design, were clear and methodical. He pointed to each detail, explaining briefly but precisely. No fancy jargon, no hollow phrases, just practical, seasoned, and straightforward knowledge. Diane rested her chin on her hand, seemingly considering. Jared continued reviewing the documents and taking notes, but when Eli finished, Rachel could see the atmosphere in the room had shifted. No one said it aloud, yet everyone could discern the difference between someone who had read about architecture and someone who had lived in it. By the end of the meeting, Charles Monroe was absent, yet one of his senior assistants stepped in to collect the report. Rachel knew the materials would be sent to the board for review, and the final decision would still rest with people who judged the file rather than the person. But she didn't falter. As they left the room, Eli paused at the door, looked at Rachel and said softly, "I'm not used to meetings like this, but if you believe I can do it, I will do my best." Rachel looked back at him and replied, "No, I do not think. I know." And for the first time since entering this company, she felt as if she had done something right, not just for the project, but for the principles she had nearly lost along the way. 3 weeks after the tense meeting, Eli Turner was officially appointed as the lead engineer for the Denver Theater restoration project. It was a quiet victory, without applause, without a grand signing ceremony, just a confirmation email and a small office key for the old building near the construction site. But for Eli, it meant more than any lucrative contract could. It was a second chance, rare and fragile, but real. On his first day at the site, Eli pushed open the rusted iron door of the old theater. The scent of rotting wood dust and time filled the air like a living memory. The vaulted ceiling was cracked, the audience seats covered in dust so thick the original wood color was unrecognizable. Yet amid the rubble, Eli saw potential. He did not see ruins. He saw a story. And to preserve that story, he needed a team who shared his belief. Rachel suggested an additional initiative combine the restoration with vocational training for young people who had not had the chance to attend college, those left behind by the mainstream hiring programs. She said instead of hiring a large subcontractor, why not make this a test site for an apprenticeship model restoring while training? Eli looked at her for a long moment and nodded. The idea was not new, but it required someone patient enough to see it through, and he trusted that if Rachel dared propose it, he would dare execute it. A few days later, Eli met the first group of apprentice workers. They were young people from working-class neighborhoods around Denver, some who had dropped out of school, others who had been rejected by major contractors. Among them was a boy named Mateo, 19 years old, small in stature but with bright eyes. When Eli asked what he knew about construction, Mateo answered honestly he had only ever assembled IKEA shelves for his mother and repainted the living room. A few people laughed, but Eli did not. He said, "That is enough to start." The first days were not easy. Eli taught them how to measure accurately by eye, how to listen to the sound of a hammer on wood to detect rot, how to maintain balance on scaffolding, and most importantly, how to respect an old structure as part of collective memory. Not everyone understood immediately. Not everyone was eager. But those who stayed after the first afternoon were the ones who wanted to learn. One morning, while the group was prying up damaged floorboards, part of the underlying structure suddenly collapsed. No one was hurt, but dust filled the air and the group stood frozen amid the echoing crash. Rachel arrived only a few minutes after being called. She saw Eli sitting on the floor beside Mateo, the two of them inspecting the cracks. No panic, no blame, just focus and a trace of fatigue on their faces. Rachel asked quietly, "Are you okay?" Eli looked up, brushed dust from his sleeves, and said, "We discovered something important. The central wooden beam had been more deeply infested by termites than the plans indicated. If it had not collapsed today, it would have collapsed when the audience arrived. Better that it fell now." That day, they paused construction. Eli and the team redrew the entire support structure. Rachel called an urgent meeting persuading management to allocate additional funds for reinforcement. During the meeting, when a supervisor questioned why an unqualified person was handling such a critical area, Rachel responded calmly, "The very person you call unqualified discovered a problem that the previous 3 bidding companies did not see. And if you fear risk, remember the greatest risk is losing faith in people." At the end of the day, Rachel returned to the construction site to find Eli standing alone studying the new plans. She asked him if he regretted taking on the project. Eli shook his head. "No, I only wish I had started sooner." There was fatigue in his eyes, but beneath it shone the light of someone beginning to believe that something could be rebuilt, not just a building, but a life. That morning, the physical therapy room was quieter than usual. Gentle autumn sunlight filtered through the large windows, spreading across the wooden floor like thin ribbons of silk. Rachel sat on her familiar exercise chair, hands lightly gripping the support bars on either side, eyes fixed on her motionless legs. She had been here for 3 years over and over, relearning movements that once seemed simple, rotating her ankles, lightly tightening her thighs, or even just sensing the presence of her toes. Some days, progress came in millimeters, while other weeks her body refused to respond at all. Yet she had never given up. Perhaps it was her determined nature, perhaps she did not want her father to think the accident had turned her into someone useless. But recently her motivation had shifted. Since working with Eli and witnessing his quiet commitment to the decaying theater, Rachel no longer saw herself merely as a survivor. She wanted to be a creator. She wanted to rise, not merely to walk again, but to reach places she had never believed possible. She drew a deep breath, looked at the therapist waiting before her, and nodded. The therapist placed his hands on her elbows, guiding her once more through the breathing technique, the method of channeling strength from her hips, rather than relying solely on her arm. Rachel closed her eyes, picturing the old theater, the timber beams, the crumbling vaulted ceiling, and Eli's hands sketching and rebuilding every detail. If a building could rise again after long decay, so could a person. She opened her eyes. "Begin." Her arms gripped the bar tighter. She tensed her lower abdominal muscles, sending intent down through her hips and thighs. A faint contraction in her left thigh trembled, not forceful, but undeniable. The therapist watched his eyes beginning to change. Rachel's breathing quickened and she pressed on. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she lifted her body a few inches higher, enough for her hips to briefly leave the chair. Just a few seconds. But for Rachel, it was the first step forward in nearly 3 years. When her body relaxed back onto the chair, tears streamed down her cheeks. Not from pain, but from finally feeling truly reconnected with herself. The therapist gently patted her shoulder, no words needed. Both understood the significance of the moment. It was not merely physical progress, but a signal from within that her body had not given up. On the way home, Rachel did not call the driver as usual. She lingered in the car a while longer, looking at her legs and whispering, "I know you're still there." The words might have sounded foolish, but to her they were a promise. That evening during the sight team meeting, Rachel entered in her wheelchair as usual. Yet something was different in her expression. Her eyes were brighter, her breath steady, and her voice firmer as she discussed adjustments to the theater's interior lighting plan. Eli looked at her without comment, but Rachel knew he noticed. After the meeting, she stayed a little longer sitting beside the wooden scaffolding where the new bricks were being placed by hand one by one. Eli approached, handed her a cup of hot coffee, and sat down beside her, saying nothing. Rachel held the cup with both hands, slightly trembling, then whispered, "This morning I stood up. Just for a few seconds." Eli didn't turn to look at her, but his voice lowered just enough to rise above the wind drifting through the cracks. "I know a building when it is ready to stand. It has its own way of signaling. Perhaps people do too." She looked at him and smiled. Inside her rose a sense of peace she had never known. For the first time, she did not feel alone on this journey. And for the first time, she truly believed she was moving forward. On an early winter Saturday morning, when snow still clung lightly to the rooftops and the streets were not yet crowded, Rachel received an unexpected message from Eli. There was no long introduction, just a few brief words. "If you are free, Sophie and I would like to invite you for breakfast. Bring a slightly adventurous appetite." Below the message was the address of a small wooden house south of Denver near Washington Park. Rachel stared at the screen for a moment, then smiled. She was accustomed to Eli's simple, measured way of communicating, but today in that invitation there was a warmth she had not felt before. She accepted. When Rachel arrived, Sophie was the one to open the door. The girl, about 8 years old, with golden hair tied high, wore a blue sweater decorated with foxes sledding in the snow. She greeted Rachel as if they had known each other for years, then quickly led her into the kitchen, where the aroma of toast and melting butter filled the air. Eli stood by the stove holding a frying pan. His sleeves rolled up, face more relaxed than Rachel had ever seen on the construction site. He turned, slightly nodded in greeting, and then pointed to the table. "We have peanut butter, strawberry jam, scrambled eggs, and what Sophie calls happy toast." Rachel smiled, nodded in thanks, and sat down. The meal was simple, yet full of warmth. Sophie shared stories from school, a squirrel she had seen the day before, and her soon-to-fall baby tooth that refused to come out. Rachel listened without interrupting, feeling as if she were seated inside a rhythm of life she had long observed only through a window. After breakfast, Sophie took Rachel's hand and led her to a small desk by the window, where an unfinished watercolor painting lay. "I'm drawing my dad's theater," she said, "but I don't know how to paint the ceiling because I haven't been inside." Rachel looked at the painting. The colors were bright, the curved rows of seats like arms embracing the audience, the stage painted pale yellow, and above it a blank space. She asked softly, "What do you think the ceiling looks like?" Sophie tilted her head, thinking, then whispered, "Like a little sky, then paint it with stars." Rachel said, "Even a theater needs its own sky to dream." Sophie cheered, picked up her brush, and began painting silver stars. Meanwhile, Eli washed dishes in the kitchen, occasionally glancing at the two of them. His expression no longer carried the fatigue of a construction site leader, but that of a father, quiet, patient, and ordinary. After Sophie left the desk to play outside with the neighbors, Rachel and Eli sat together with cups of coffee. The silence between them was no longer awkward. She said, "Sophie is very creative. She seems to feel the rhythm of what is being built." Eli nodded. "She takes after her mother. Sarah used to paint murals in the school library, each piece telling a story in every detail. I think in some way, Sophie remembers her mother by continuing to paint." Rachel stayed silent, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood. Everyone in this house was healing in their own way. An old building, a father who had lost his wife, a child who missed her mother, and a young woman learning to walk again. But in that morning light, they all flowed together and no one was left behind. Before leaving, Rachel stopped in front of Sophie's painting. In the little sky of the theater, dozens of stars now sparkled, each with a small dot in the center like an eye watching. Rachel bent down and wrote lightly in the corner, "Every star is a wish being heard." Sophie would understand later, and perhaps in doing so, Rachel was writing a wish of her own. That afternoon, when Rachel returned to the office, a light rain had begun to fall. Tiny droplets clung to the window pane like hundreds of memories, trapped unable to flow away. She had just left a warm morning at Eli and Sophie's home, a place full of gentle life and sincerity. Returning here, the air felt colder, sharper, as if echoing the imminent presence of someone she had always kept at a careful distance in her heart. Charles Monroe was waiting for her in the conference room upstairs. His assistant had only said briefly that he wanted to meet directly to discuss the second phase budget for the theater project. Rachel knew well that this was not just about money. When she stepped into the room, her father was already standing, a pristine white shirt, an ash-gray tie, and a gaze calm yet cold. On the table lay the latest cost estimates and a few printed color plans of the revised design proposed by Eli. He did not look at her immediately, continuing to flip through each page, fingers tapping lightly along the edge as if sorting through every detail to find a flaw. Finally, he looked up. "Rachel, I think we need to review the entire technical plan. The current lead, Eli Turner, lacks the proper credentials. The project is under significant financial pressure. We cannot let sentiment guide decisions." Rachel drew a deep breath, keeping her voice steady. But Eli is the person who understands this structure best. He discovered a sagging point no previous team saw. The way he works with the apprentice team is creating a genuine learning environment. Charles interrupted. No one denies his enthusiasm, but that does not replace official expertise. The investors in this project do not just look at results, they look at the credentials of the person carrying it out. Rachel gripped the armrest of her wheelchair lightly. In that moment, she felt like the 15-year-old girl presenting a design idea to her father for the first time, trembling, knowing every word could be torn apart by sharp eyes. But she was no longer that child, and this time she did not speak to ask permission, she spoke to assert. "Father, I did not choose Eli out of sentiment. I chose him because he has lived and worked with projects like this his entire life. What he lacks on paper he makes up for with practical experience and dedication, and most importantly, people like him deserve the same opportunity as anyone else." Charles stood still for a moment, then gently pulled a chair opposite her. He was not angry, but his voice carried something hard to define, perhaps disappointment, perhaps unspoken fear. "You are letting yourself be swayed by personal stories. That is not how one runs a company." Rachel met his gaze directly. "No, I'm being strong enough to see the real person behind what the documents do not reveal. If Mother had not believed in what I could do, judging only by test results and grades, I might not even be sitting here now." Silence settled heavily between them. Charles looked at her for the first time, holding his gaze long as if searching for a part of himself he had long neglected in his daughter's eyes. Finally, he nodded slightly. "You are responsible for this decision. If any issues arise, you will report directly to the board." Rachel nodded. "I'm ready." When her father left the room, the door closed softly, yet echoed in the stillness. She sat there, watching the rain against the window, understanding that this conversation was more than a business dispute. It was the first time she had truly stood up, not just for a project, but for a belief, for a person, and for herself. That morning, the 15th floor conference room at Monroe Urban Design glowed under cold white lights, reflecting off the long glass table covered with documents, drawings, and neatly printed budget reports. The room, usually reserved for cautious nods and calculated handshakes, carried a different energy today. Rachel rolled in the wheels of her chair, making soft clicks on the stone floor, each rotation precise and confident. In her tailored gray suit hair, neatly tied, her gaze calm yet unwavering, she entered without hesitation. She had awaited this day for months, and though she anticipated what lay ahead, she did not turn back. Charles Monroe sat at the center. Beside him were Diane Walker, head of engineering, Jared Stone from the budget office, and 3 members of the investment board. All were familiar faces to Rachel, yet distant in principle. A few nodded lightly as she entered, others only glanced at the files before them. Once everyone was seated, Charles began. "We are here to review the progress and risks in the second phase of the Denver Theater Restoration Project. There are concerns about personnel choices and implementation direction. I want a direct analysis from Rachel." She nodded and opened her presentation. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and decisive. The project was nearly a third complete. The first phase finished 13% under budget, uncovering serious structural issues that 3 previous surveying teams had missed. The discovery was made by Eli Turner, now the lead engineer. She displayed before and after site photos and comparative cost charts. She continued, "He does not have a university degree, but he has over 20 years of field experience. Moreover, the apprenticeship training model implemented alongside the team has reduced labor costs while maintaining quality." Jared interrupted. "I acknowledge the promising numbers, but the board's concern lies in legal liability. If an accident or technical failure occurs, who is responsible when the lead lacks official certification?" Diane nodded. "I have worked on large-scale projects. Absence of formal credentials is a risk that cannot be ignored." Rachel paused a few seconds, then replied calmly, "We have hired a qualified consulting engineer to review all plans prepared by Eli. Everything meets standards, and if risk is what we fear most, then the greatest risk is continuing to exclude talented people simply because they did not follow a traditional path." Eyes in the room began to shift. Some leaned forward, others reopened reports in front of them. Rachel looked directly at the board. "You may continue to place your bets on degrees, but I ask you to look at results. I am proposing a model that does not only rebuild a theater, but opens opportunities for dozens of young people who have been left behind. I'm not doing this out of sentiment. I do it because it works, and it is right." Charles leaned forward. His voice was not harsh yet carried enough weight to hush the room. "If results are what you are using to justify, let me be clear. If any mistake occurs in the next phase, you will bear full personal responsibility." Rachel did not look away. Her gaze met her father's steady. She had been ready for a long time. Perhaps he had never believed, but for the first time she knew exactly what she was doing. Silence enveloped the room, thick as if everyone were holding their breath for the final verdict. Then a board member at the far end spoke. "I have reviewed all progress and reports. If the data are accurate, then perhaps the greatest risk here is preventing something effective simply because it does not follow the old way. I agree to proceed with Phase 2 with the current team." Another nodded. Agreed. Jared and Diane said nothing, only nodded lightly, reluctant but not opposing. Charles remained silent for a long moment. Finally, he signaled his assistant to collect the documents. The meeting ended. As everyone stood to leave, Rachel remained seated, not because she could not stand, but because she wanted to fully absorb what had just happened. No applause, no congratulatory hugs, but within that silence was acknowledgement, for the first time. Not because of whose daughter she was, but because of who she was herself, and that was what she had waited her whole life to achieve. Phase 2 of the project began with a tension like a taut string. Decisions made in that fateful meeting were no longer theories on paper. They became concrete actions on every beam, every wall cracked by time. The construction team entered the old theater as if stepping into an experiment of trust. Eli understood the pressure weighing on everyone's shoulders. Every misplaced nail, every slightly off measurement could become a reason for someone to overturn all the opportunities he and Rachel had fought to protect. But he did not allow himself to be consumed by fear. He instilled that spirit in the whole team, especially the apprentices. Mateo, the young boy who had once only assembled shelves in his living room, was now in charge of measuring the entire secondary frame. Beside him, Alina, a girl who had dropped out of school to care for her sick mother, now redrew the electrical diagrams for the entire second-tier auditorium. None of them had impressive resumes. Yet with each passing day, they made the theater walls stand taller, the foundation stronger, and the atmosphere on site resembled a classroom without blackboards. Rachel often arrived in the afternoons. She was no longer merely an observer. She proposed adjusting the emergency exits to accommodate wheelchair users, consulted with the lighting engineer to optimize natural light through the glass dome. Every step she took, still aided by her support frame, was living proof of the project's spirit. Some days went smoothly, but others brought relentless challenges. One midweek morning, heavy rain that had lasted all night seeped into the north wall. A section of old bricks came loose, revealing severe mold and rot that had gone undetected. Jared arrived a few hours later with members of the inspection department. No one said it aloud, but all understood this was the next test. Eli did not make excuses. He walked them step by step through the remedial process, presenting clear, itemized plans for reconstruction. Rachel stayed by his side, observing without intervening. But when Jared asked whether he could complete it within the deadline, Rachel spoke up. "If anyone knows how to save a section of a wall from a bygone era without destroying it entirely, it is Eli. And if he says it can be done, I trust him to do it." Finally, the inspection team agreed to an additional 2 weeks on the condition of daily progress reports. For the first time, Rachel saw Eli's eyes soften for a brief moment. After the meeting, he sat alone on the old steps that would become the audience waiting area. She sat beside him. He said, "Some days I feel inadequate. Not enough credentials, not enough time, not enough strength." She looked at him for a long while, then replied, "I have felt the same. But not enough does not mean impossible. The only difference is whether we dare to continue." He remained silent, then smiled a small smile, yet enough to restore the breath of a long day. The project continued, and with every brick preserved instead of torn out, with every wire hidden to maintain the beauty of the vaulted ceiling, the theater gradually became a symbol. Not just of restoration, but of those who had been underestimated, excluded, deemed insufficient. It was no longer merely an architectural structure. It was a silent declaration, a message that all things of value take time to be recognized, and sometimes what seems weakest becomes the most enduring foundation for a new beginning. On a Monday morning, Diane Walker arrived at the construction site earlier than the crew. In her dark business suit, heels clicking steadily on the old tiled floors, she walked past the barriers like a stranger in a place long familiar to Eli and the apprentices. A few eyes lifted to watch her, not out of curiosity, but because she represented doubt, the voice that had questioned how the project was being executed. Diane paid no attention. She walked straight to the west section, where the brick wall had just been repaired after the recent heavy rain. In her hands was the detailed design drawing Eli had submitted the previous week, and this time she came to inspect in person rather than pointing from behind a conference table. Eli saw her from afar. He wiped his hands on a gray cloth and approached. "Good morning." Diane nodded. "No small talk, no smile. We need to talk about the ventilation system. In your drawings, I noticed you proposed moving the main air vent to the north side." Eli nodded. "The southern part of the dome has a weaker structure. Keeping the original design would create uneven pressure over time and bend the secondary beams." Diane was silent for a moment. She stepped closer, looked up at the dome, then back down at the drawings. After a few minutes, she said, "Reasonable. I'll coordinate with the design team to make adjustments." Eli was slightly surprised. Previously, every change he proposed had to pass through multiple rounds of scrutiny, often with Diane as the toughest critic. He said nothing, only nodded. "Thank you." Diane turned to leave, but paused. "You know, I once worked on a warehouse restoration project in Detroit. At the time, I opposed allowing local residents to participate. I thought they lacked the skills. But one of them, an older man, was the one who discovered a leaking gas pipe that could have caused an explosion. Since then, I began to learn to listen more." She turned to Eli, her gaze softening for the first time. "I let prejudice guide me too long. Perhaps it's time to start over." Eli did not respond immediately. He just smiled. This project is the right place to begin. From that day, Diane no longer held the role of distant overseer. She appeared on site more often, engaging directly with the engineering team, sitting for hours with the apprentices to explain drawings, guiding them in reading technical symbols. Mateo, usually quiet, asked her about the principles of convection in ventilation design. Alina asked how to calculate load for the second-tier stage railings. Diane not only answered, but also provided additional reading materials. Once she said to Rachel, "I used to think buildings were lifeless objects. Now I see it breathes." Rachel replied, "Because for the first time, it is built by people who know they can make a difference." A week later, Diane brought a set of manual measuring tools to the site, the kind architecture students use to practice sensing spatial proportions. She handed them to Mateo. "Not everything can be measured with machines. Some details can only be felt with eyes, hands, and experience. You should learn to trust your senses." Mateo held the tools, eyes lighting up, as if for the first time someone had recognized his capability. That afternoon, Diane stayed later than usual. She stood alone in the auditorium's sunlight, streaming through the roof window onto the partially finished wooden seats. She placed her hands on the seat back and slowly sat down, as if testing the feeling of a future audience member. In that moment, Diane was no longer the supervisor, no longer the skeptic. She was simply a woman who had once doubted, once feared risk, and was now learning to trust again. Trust others, trust the building, and perhaps for the first time in a long while, trust herself. That afternoon, the theater was still cluttered with scaffolding and sawdust, but the stage had been rebuilt almost completely. The new red curtain, still carrying the scent of fresh fabric, had just been hung, falling softly against the original brick wall, preserved behind it like a memory deliberately left untouched. Rachel sat at the edge of the stage, her hand resting lightly on the dark wooden trim. A cold breeze slipped in through the open door, carrying the soft clatter of the crew finishing the last rows of seating. Eli stood below, guiding Mateo through the stage lighting adjustments. Sophie sat off to one side, sketching her eyes, absorbing every detail around her. Diane watched quietly from a distance. Rachel inhaled deeply. Then she turned to the others. "Please, give me a few minutes." Every eye shifted toward her. No one spoke, but the rhythm of the work slowed on its own. Rachel braced her hands on the support bars beside her, lifted herself with the strength of legs still fragile, and stepped onto the stage with a newfound freedom she had fought for day by day. She did not need anyone to steady her. She took her place at the center of the stage. One step, then another, and she stopped. I have thought about this moment for a long time. Not to give a speech, only to stand here in this exact place and say something I have kept hidden for years. She looked out at the empty seats as if imagining the faces of a future audience listening the way the people before her were listening now. I once believed I could control everything, the plans, the path, the ambition, the future. I worked hard. I was accepted into a prestigious school. I thought I had an answer for every problem, but no one taught me how to face the moment when everything disappears. The accident happened on a winter night. After leaving a meeting where I had argued fiercely with my father, I drove as though I could outrun my own anger. Snow fell. The roads were slick, but I did not slow down. The car skidded off the shoulder and rolled. When I woke, I could no longer feel my legs. Rachel paused, her eyes steady as if holding the memory in place so it would not swallow her. She continued, "I spent more than a year refusing to accept it. I let no one see the pain. I laughed, said I was fine, worked through email, kept everything sealed inside a perfect shell. But the night my diploma arrived by mail, when I sat alone without friends, without family, I stayed in the dark for nearly 3 hours, staring at the wall, asking myself whether I still meant anything at all." Eli looked at her from below, his face composed, though his eyes betrayed emotion. Rachel turned toward him. "And then on a rainy afternoon, I met a man who did not ask why I was sitting alone. He simply knelt, lifted a camera to my eye level, and said he wanted to capture me from the angle that suited me best. No pity, no need for explanations, just a moment of kindness. And that moment changed me." Sophie gripped her paintbrush more tightly. Diane lowered her head, swallowing something heavy in her throat. Rachel went on. "This theater is not just a restoration project. It is how I'm learning to stand again. How I am learning to believe I still have something to offer. Every brick here is a piece of a healing journey, not only mine, but of everyone who has ever been cast aside. And I stand here today not because I have fully recovered. I stand because I'm no longer afraid of being imperfect. I do not need to be rescued. I only need to be seen." She looked at each of them. Eli, who had seen her before she saw herself. Diane, who had once opposed her, now guiding others. Sophie, a child young enough to sense what adults forget. And the apprentices whose hands were rebuilding not only a theater but hope itself. Rachel slowly sat back down, tired but lighter. She didn't know where her words would travel. But for the first time, she held nothing back. No shame, no fear. The stage, the walls, and the people present were the most important audience she could ever speak to. They were part of a new life, and Rachel knew she had stepped into a new chapter with her own legs, her own voice, and a heart no longer afraid of the past. That morning sunlight streamed through the freshly polished glass of the dome, casting a beam across the stage like a light of new beginnings. The Denver Theater, after months of restoration, was finally complete. No more sawdust, no more drills. Instead, there were murmured conversations, the soft click of shoes on the newly finished wooden floor, and laughter rising from the audience area where the apprentices were testing the seats as the first visitors. Rachel stood at the back of the stage, looking through the red curtains tied neatly to either side. She was not wearing her usual suit. Today she wore a long, simple blue dress, soft and flowing. Her hair fell loosely, stirred slightly by the breeze drifting in through the side door. Her legs still needed support, but she stood straight, no longer trembling as she had on the first days. Eli stepped in from the side sleeves, rolled up faded jeans. His hand still bore traces of paint from the stage sign. He stood beside her for a long moment without speaking, then asked softly, "Ready?" Rachel nodded. Words were unnecessary. Everything important had already been shared through the months they had spent building this place together. Outside the auditorium, the first to enter were the apprentices, followed by some neighborhood residents, city representatives, and a few local reporters. Diane sat in the second row next to Jared. Both wore formal attire, yet their eyes could not hide curiosity mingled with surprise at the transformed space they had once doubted. At the far end, Sophie sat in a pale yellow dress, clutching her sketchbook, eyes wide with anticipation. As the lights dimmed and then brightened on the stage, Rachel stepped forward once more. But this time, not to confess or recount the past, but to welcome the future. She spoke of the theater's journey, of the people who had helped build it, not only with their skills, but with untold stories. She mentioned Eli as a silent teacher, Diane as proof that change was possible, the apprentices as a fresh wind for a generation no one had considered. Finally, she looked around the auditorium, where light reflected on the new wooden seats, red velvet curtains, and vaulted ceiling details preserved in classic style. This was not merely a restoration project. It was proof that no one is truly left behind if there is a place to return to, if someone sees the potential hidden behind the cracks of the past. As the ceremony ended, the stage lights shifted from white to warm gold. Sophie stepped forward, holding the painting she had completed. On the paper was the theater beneath a starry sky, each star bearing a name: Rachel, Eli, Sophie, Mateo, Alina, Diane, and many others, not for fame, but because they had been here, had lived, and had contributed to this miracle. She handed the painting to Rachel. "This is our sky." Rachel embraced it, tears slipping down her cheeks unhidden. Outside the theater's large windows, winter was approaching, but inside, everything shone as if it were spring. Every brick, every decorative detail, every corner held a piece of the journey that had been traveled. No one soul stood aside. No one remained only an observer. The theater had come alive, and within its revival was a community built from trust, resilience, and hands once deemed insufficient. This was not merely the restoration of an old building. It was the restoration of hearts once broken. And today all stood together, under the lights in each other's gaze, as if the world had always held a place for a new beginning. A month after the Denver Theater's grand opening, as the first community performances lit up the stage, Rachel sat alone in the small office on the second floor of the old building, now transformed into a shared workspace. Outside the window, a few snowflakes drifted in the cold breeze, covering the cobblestone path that led to the theater's back gate. She was reading a handwritten letter, the soft slanting script blurred in places, the ink spreading lightly as though each line held emotions not yet dry. It was from a 17-year-old girl named Sarah, living in the southern suburbs of Denver. In the letter, Sarah wrote that she had watched Rachel's speech through a shared video online. For the first time, she felt understood, felt that someone could grasp what it meant to be forgotten by the world, simply because her body was no longer whole. Sarah had been paralyzed on one side after a bicycle accident at 13. Her mother worked 2 jobs to cover medical expenses while her father left the family soon after. Still, Sarah pursued online studies, taught herself to draw, experimented with writing scripts, and dreamed of one day standing behind the wings of a real theater. Rachel finished reading, her hand resting on the final line where Sarah wrote, "I do not want pity. I only want to try. To have a chance like everyone else." Those words lingered in Rachel's mind for days. She thought of herself on graduation day, of Sophie presenting the painting full of stars, of Eli kneeling to take her first photograph. Opportunity does not come from luck. It comes from the courage of someone willing to see what others overlook. And so, the idea for a scholarship program began to take shape. Rachel drafted the first proposal that night, sending it to some of the donors who had helped fund the theater's restoration. She made no promises of results. She simply told Sarah's story as she had once told her own. She named it the Sarah Scholarship, not because Sarah was the first, but because the name represented all those who had once been labeled with invisible words like unqualified, unsuitable, or incapable. A week later, Diane was the first to sign the long-term funding commitment. Jared, who had been the most hesitant, replied with only 3 words in an email: "I fully support." Charles Monroe said nothing, yet a substantial transfer appeared in the fund account under his parent company's name. When Rachel called to thank him, he said only, "I knew you were right." The scholarship launch took place right on the Denver Theater stage. Rachel did not speak much. She simply shared the letter, told the story of a 17-year-old girl named Sarah, and explained that this was more than a scholarship. It was a door open to anyone who had ever thought there was no way forward. The ceremony was small, with no television cameras, no advertising banners. Yet as Rachel stepped off the stage, a young girl in an electric wheelchair was waiting at the end of the row. Short brown hair, bright eyes, a notebook filled with drawings in her hands. She was Sarah. Her voice trembled but carried dignity. Rachel knelt to meet her at eye level, took her hand and said simply, "Thank you for having the courage to speak up." Not every dream begins with applause, but sometimes it begins with a handwritten letter, an honest gaze, and an acknowledgement that even when the world turns away, there are still places ready to open wide. The Denver Theater now lit up not just on weekends. Every year it would welcome at least 5 people like Sarah, like Mateo, like Alina. People who did not need to prove perfection, only to be given a chance to begin. And amidst the music echoing through the auditorium, among the stories shared on stage, Sarah's name would always be present, a symbol, a reminder that everyone deserves a place in the light. One year after the Sarah Scholarship ceremony, Rachel stood at the entrance of the Riverside Community Center, where the walls were alive with the colorful artwork of scholarship students glowing under the spring sunlight. No wheelchair, only a simple cane in her hand, and her own determined legs, and the resilient spirit she had built over the past 12 months. A gentle breeze stirred a few strands of her hair, carrying the scent of wood and fresh paint from the exhibition space. She inhaled deeply, feeling each step she took, every calf muscle, remembering the long therapy sessions behind her. Rachel recalled those first days when she could only stand for 7 seconds on the parallel bars, gripping tightly. Heart filled with fear and frustration at a body that no longer obeyed, where a single slip could send her crashing down. But now she moved with confidence, each step like a dance on an invisible stage. Sophie ran toward her, hair flying, eyes shining like candles in the dark. "Hello, Rachel," she shouted, her joy filling the room, and Rachel smiled, waving back. The girl had grown now 7, still radiant with a bright smile and paint-stained hands from her art projects. Rachel surveyed the carefully hung paintings, each detail meticulously completed by the students' lines and colors she had only seen before in letters or photographs. A sense of quiet fulfillment rose within her, knowing that every struggle, every drop of sweat, every fall had meaning. Eli stepped out from the far end of the room, dressed simply in office attire, yet his eyes shone with pride. He looked at Rachel, a smile halfway between serious and joyful. As Sophie ran to hug his legs, her voice ringing with excitement, "We've prepared a special corner to display the first projects of the students," he said. Rachel nodded. Feeling happiness spread through her as she saw the results of a year's effort. She approached Eli, her hand brushing gently over the painting. Sophie had just completed the bright colors, reflecting the light of hope and trust. Every step Rachel took in that room was proof of months of struggle, perseverance, and the love of those around her who had never stopped believing in her. She looked toward the window where the morning light illuminated the paintings, the radiant faces of the students, and herself, a person who had learned to walk again, to trust herself, to turn small moments into great victories. Rachel took a deep breath, feeling a freedom she had never known. Freedom not only of the body, but of the spirit. Freedom in every step she could now take alone, and a deep conviction that from now on, nothing could limit her from reaching the next good thing. She took Sophie's hand, and together they walked through the exhibition, stepping on the polished wooden floor where every brushstroke and paint mark testified to patience and courage. Rachel smiled, feeling her heartbeat in sync with the life around her. A place where a year ago she had only been able to sit quietly, and now she stood amid the vibrancy of color, hope, and new opportunities. This was the moment she knew that every effort, every tear, every fall had brought her here. And in Sophie's eyes, Rachel saw her own reflection, a person who had emerged from darkness into light, no longer needing a wheelchair, no longer needing help. Only willpower, trust, and steadfast legs to carry her into the future. Rachel took Sophie's hand and stepped out of the exhibition space, sunlight glinting off the girl's golden hair, and she realized that this was not just an ordinary morning. It was a moment that captured the true bond among 3 people, a family chosen, not merely defined by blood. Eli walked beside them, his hand always ready to steady Sophie whenever she jumped or ran across the polished wooden floor. His gaze toward Rachel radiated warmth, not as a boss to an employee, but as a companion, a protector, and a partner in her journey of recovery. Sophie squealed with delight when she spotted a new corner in the room, a place where she could display her freshly finished paintings. Rachel laughed along, feeling happiness ripple through every heartbeat. She turned to Eli and noticed the fine lines around his eyes, marks of sleepless nights and quiet efforts spent both caring for Sophie and holding on to faith in the future. Words were unnecessary between them. Glances and small gestures conveyed everything. Rachel remembered the days a year ago when she could barely stand for a few seconds on the parallel bars, aching lonely, and how Eli and Sophie's presence had been a sudden light in her life. Now, as they moved through the rooms together, each step Rachel took was steady, yet she still held Eli's hand, a symbol of mutual trust. Sophie held on to both their hands, her radiant smile and bright eyes, reflecting the joy of seeing her painting placed in a place of honor. Rachel felt deeply that family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes it is the people who appear at the right moment supporting you when you think you cannot go on. Eli looked at Rachel, his voice low, warm, yet serious. We've been through so much, but seeing Sophie this happy, everything has been worth it. Rachel nodded, feeling the warmth spread from her heart throughout her body, knowing that this bond was built from patience, shared moments and challenges overcome together. They stopped at the center corner where the largest paintings were displayed. Rachel looked at Sophie and said, "You did so well." Eli stood behind her, gently placing a hand on Rachel's shoulder, silently saying, "We are here together." The girl turned to Eli, eyes shining. "Dad, we are a family, right?" Eli smiled. "Yes, we are a family not just by birth but by choice, sharing the ups and downs of life together." Rachel looked at both of them, seeing in Sophie's eyes absolute trust and in Eli's eyes tireless devotion, realizing that a true family is made of the people you choose to walk through life with, creating memories, joy, and the strength to keep moving forward. Hand in hand, they stepped into the courtyard, sunlight falling on Sophie's hair, on her radiant face, on Rachel's confident smile, and on Eli's proud eyes, all forming a living portrait of connection of a family forged through choice, trust, love, and unconditional support. Rachel drew a deep breath, feeling each step solid on the ground, knowing that from now on she would never be alone, that every step she took carried the presence, protection, and companionship of those who had chosen to be her family, and that alone was enough to make her feel safe, happy, and filled with hope for the future. Rachel sat at her desk in her new office, daylight streaming through the window onto the photograph Eli had taken in the rainy cafe a year ago. Capturing the moment, she smiled brightly for the first time after the accident and loss. She looked at the photo, remembering the days when she thought she could not stand, could not continue yet through the unexpected presence of a stranger and his young daughter. Her world had opened a new door. The photograph was not just a memory, but a symbol of kindness, of small actions capable of changing a life. Rachel felt the importance of treasuring every moment and seeing potential in others, not based on degrees or fame, but on heart experience and perseverance. She recalled her journey of recovery, the first tentative steps on the parallel bars, small victories like baking bread without burning it or smiling at Sophie's drawings, all triumphs she had once thought impossible. And she realized that in life what matters is not what you have or what is written on paper, but how you recognize support and give opportunities to others. How you persist even when challenges seem insurmountable. This lesson is not just for her, but for all of us, that kindness, empathy, and faith in human potential can create extraordinary change. Rachel placed the photograph beside Sophie's artworks and Eli's project plans, recognizing that family, friendship, and support are priceless values far beyond material wealth or prestige. If this story has touched your heart, subscribe, like, and share the YouTube channel Emotional Echoes to continue hearing moving and inspiring stories every day. Share your thoughts in the comments below so we can know your perspective and discuss together the meaningful life lessons we can apply in reality. We want to hear from you, from everyday stories full of significance, from small moments that create great change. Thank you for watching today's video, and we wish all viewers good health, joy, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.